slap a magnetic mine on the side of the thing, and he'll knock it out. There's nothing that crew can do about it. It's a weak, bad design. It doesn't have a secondary weapon, a coaxial machine gun. The Russians do the same thing though. They're keeping pace. The Su-152, I mean, you can see the scale here of that thing. You're talking about a 152 millimeter artillery piece has been mounted on that. That is extraordinary. The explosive firepower put out by something like one of those is absolutely incredible. The biggest German tank of the war is the King Tiger. This comes about in 1944. Fortunately, very few of these are produced. They're excellent tanks, technologically speaking. They have heavy guns, much heavier than anything on an American or British tank in the war. Very, very effective designs. To give you an example of how effective these German Tiger tanks were, there was a German tank commander. His name was Michael Wittmann, 2 T's, W-I-T-T-M-A-N, Michael Wittmann, at a place called Villers-Bocage in Normandy. And with one Tiger tank, Michael Wittmann knocked out something like 18 British tanks, almost 30 Bren gun carriers, and several dozen trucks. This one German tank did this. He was positioned at a crossroads where he was able to hold it off fairly well, keep the British at bay. What ended up happening with this battle at Villers-Bocage, after Wittmann knocked out all these tanks, he and his crew prepared to move. They were getting ready to retreat back. They'd run low on ammunition, but they developed engine difficulties and they had to abandon their tank. So, yeah, German tanks are technologically superior to most others. But let's talk about our tank for a minute. Let's talk about the U.S. and what we had. We come into World War II with this design, the Sherman tank. Almost everybody's heard of it. Certainly if you watch the movie Fury, you have some idea about what being in a tank like this would be like. If you've not watched Fury and you're interested in it, it's a decent film. The American Sherman tank. Technologically, behind. Not as good a tank as the Russians, not as good a tank as the Germans. Why? Why is it that America, with all of its industrial potential and all of our love of technology, why do we settle for a tank like this in World War II? A lot of it has to do with our experiences in World War I. In World War I, we learned the lesson that light, fast tanks are the way to go. And so in the interwar period, this is what we did. We went with light, fast tanks. Now the Sherman has some positives to it. The Sherman has a really good engine. Of all the tanks in World War II, the Sherman's engine is the most reliable of any of them. Any tank in World War II is not going to match the Sherman for engine reliability. But the Sherman had some other major issues. It caught on fire very easily. The Germans actually called these tanks Tommy cookers because we gave a lot of these tanks to the British with Lend-Lease, and before we got into the war in a major way, the Germans loved going up against Shermans because the Sherman is a really tall tank. It stands really tall off the ground, and so you can see it. It makes a big target, and it's easy to hit. It doesn't have really thick armor, and it catches on fire easily. And so the Germans were perfectly happy going up against these Sherman tanks. I remember I talked to a German Panzer officer. He was retired, lived in Florida, years and years ago about this. I was asking him, he fought on the Eastern Front against the Russians, he fought on the Western Front a little bit. He said, we loved going up against Sherman tanks. He said, in our German tanks, we could take several hits from a Sherman, and it would just dent the armor. You hit a Sherman once, it's going to brew up. It's going to catch on fire. You got a pretty easy time of it. A lot of people are not really into tank stuff, and they're kind of like, okay, you know, this picture kind of says it all. This is late World War II in Western Germany. The U.S. Army is moving into Germany. That's an American Sherman tank, and that's one of the German King Tigers. Just look at the size difference, right? The King Tiger has a massive 88 millimeter gun. We've got this low velocity 75. Much heavier armor, much lighter armor. Pretty much says it all. So you get to this question, why didn't we build better tanks during the war? I mean, we knew pretty much by 1941-42 that the Sherman was outgunned. We knew it was outclassed. Why didn't we swap it out for something better? Well, we had these production lines going, and it was very, very difficult in the middle of a war to stop production of one tank type and start up the production of something else. So for assembly line economic reasons, that's part of it. The Sherman was a really easily to produce tank. The Sherman is the most highly produced tank in all of history. We built something like 70,000 of these things in World War II. We had so many of them, we not only equipped our own military with it, we gave a bunch to Britain, a bunch to Russia. And Russia used it as their reserve because they preferred the T-34. But most highly produced tank in all of history. With the war coming to a close, Hitler's wonder weapons didn't work. The Germans were growing desperate. Hitler needed armored vehicles. And so he came up with this design. It's called a Stug. It stands for Sturmgeschütz. It's an assault gun. It's not technically a tank, although most people look at it and they say that's what it is. It has that continuous track, but it does not have a revolving turret. This thing has a fixed gun mounted in the mantlet up in the front. You can elevate it, and you can traverse it a few degrees either way. But to aim the thing left or right, you basically have to reorient the entire tank. So why does Hitler go with this? I mean, this is like lesser technology. It's not as good. The answer is you can produce it much more easily. You can turn out 4 or 5 Stugs in the time you could take to turn out one actual tank. So you produce these things. They're easier to mass produce, to get to the front lines. It's a wartime expediency measure. As World War II is coming to a close, the Germans are really getting desperate. They're running out of armored vehicles of any kind, but they're facing the massive Red Army with its tens and tens of thousands of tanks. They're losing to the Americans and British in the West as well. And so as the war is closing, the Germans start fielding these types of devices, a Panzerfaust, a Panzerschreck. They're basically infantry anti-tank weapons that give a single soldier the ability to knock out a tank. If he positions himself properly and he fires from the side or behind of an Allied tank, he can knock it out. Set the whole thing on fire with a pretty cheap, simple to produce weapon. That's kind of important for where we're going in a minute in terms of how armored technology is today. As we close out World War II, occasionally people who are like really into tanks will ask a question, and it's a really good one. If the German tanks were so good, like the King Tiger is sort of the ultimate tank of World War II, if they're that good, how come they didn't win? Well, because the system to support them failed. This thing takes a lot of gasoline to move. And this particular model, this is model number 312, it's outside Bastogne in Belgium, has been captured by a couple of American foot soldiers. What happened? Well, the tank ran out of gasoline. The German crew had to bail out and run away on foot, and so this tank was captured intact. These things were so large and so heavy that they had trouble maneuvering. They couldn't cross many of the bridges in Europe because the bridge wasn't rated for that weight. So yes, it's impressive as a technology, but ultimately doesn't succeed. Let's talk about the Cold War real quick as we're getting close to the end. In terms of the Cold War that followed World War II, the tank designs built on the lessons of World War II. Now the lessons of World War II said what? It said bigger guns, more armor, larger tanks. And so as the Cold War started to roll around, yes.
What are some reasons why Germany's super tanks failed at the end?
They ran out of gas, they failed to mass produce enough of them, and they couldn't move on the roads and bridges.
So they
ran out of gas, they couldn't mass produce enough of them, and they couldn't cross most bridges in Europe. So Cold War that follows, you've got these World War II inspired designs. You've got Russian designs, which are basically up-gunned, up-armored Joseph Stalin IIs. They call it the T-55, the T-64.
You did that what again? What's the last
I'll get with you after lecture. We'll square you away with it. So you've got these up-armored and up-gunned versions of the Joseph Stalin II, right? In the Americans' case, they're looking at the lessons of World War II and saying, wow, the Sherman didn't do so good. What did the German Tiger? The American Army kind of has this weird love affair with the German Tiger after the war. They're like, that was the ultimate tank. And so we start designing our post-war tanks like this M48 M60. This is an M60. But they look a lot like a German Tiger, a King Tiger at least, because that's sort of the ultimate in design. That's seen as being the ultimate step. And so previous experience is going to impact the designs going forward. A couple of people asked me previously about tank ammunition, and so I'm going to talk about the two main types briefly. Super easy to understand. Two main types, a type called high explosive anti-tank. It is basically a shell that you fire, and when it hits the side of an enemy tank or the front of enemy armor, it explodes. High explosive. Boom. Big explosion. The second type is called APFSDS, which that's a mouthful. It's this thing. It is a depleted uranium tungsten dart. It's fired out of a gun barrel. It stands for armor piercing, thin stabilized discarding sabot. I still remember that. It's incredible. The sabot, this sort of weird looking thing on it, when it clears the gun barrel, the sabot breaks apart, it dissipates, and it sends this needle-like projectile downrange. It uses kinetic energy to break through the armor of a tank or an armored vehicle, and it achieves the same objective. One of them, there's a chemical reaction, an explosion. The other one uses kinetic energy to break through the armor, but it does the same thing. Most tank crewmen who are killed inside tanks fighting in war, they're incinerated. It's either through the explosion of this thing going off, or it's through the needle punching through the armor of the tank, creates a liquid jet of plasma. So, as the Cold War continues on, the big question is not tanks, because everybody's pretty much got that. They want big guns, big armor, and both sides are building it. The question is, how do you build something that lets the infantry keep up with the tanks? I mean, if you're on foot, you're not going to be able to keep up with a tank for very long unless there's some type of technology built to do that. And so the United States and NATO in the late 50s is going to formally field this thing. It's called the M113. It's ugly. It's like a box on tracks. People have called it a battlefield taxi because what it basically does, it's a tank without a turret, and in the back you have this little hatch that opens, and you've got 8 to 12 infantrymen in there. And so this thing can roll along with the tanks, and if they get to a place where they need the infantry support, you just open the back door and the infantry runs out and does their thing. The Russians actually built a much better version of this same idea in the BMP-1. It does the same job. It's an infantry fighting vehicle. This M113 is called an armored personnel carrier. There's no real supportability here. But the BMP has this little baby tank turret, has a 100mm gun, and it can support the infantry as the infantry is involved in the fight. So the Russians kind of have the better designs here, early Cold War. It's not going to be till late in the Cold War that this gets changed. Just to show you how technology kind of spreads and evolves and adapts, in the 1960s, Sweden starts playing with this design. They call it the S-tank. It's not even really a tank. There's no turret. What is this? This is a modernized version of Germany's World War II Stub. It's an armored vehicle with a gun mounted in it. You can elevate, you can't really traverse. You have to turn the whole vehicle to do it. It's just an up-gun, modernized version of it. These ideas are not new, most of them. Throughout the Cold War, there were a few places where armor fought armor. The United States and Russia, as you well know, never actually got into a shooting war with all of this. So they tended to test their armor and their technology in these proxy wars called brush fire wars. Things like the wars between the Arab states and Israel, which went on pretty much for most of the Cold War. What those wars basically demonstrated is what World War II had already proved. You need bigger guns, more armor, bigger tanks. What you're looking at in this picture is a really interesting design from a historical standpoint because it's an old tank. That's a tank in Israeli service. It's a Sherman tank from World War II. But in the 1970s, the U.S. didn't want all the old Shermans anymore. They were taking up space in our warehouses and things. We gave them away. We gave a lot to Israel. So the Israelis have taken this M4 Sherman and they've put a few storage bins on the back of the turret. They've given it a much up-armored gun. It's a 105mm gun, but it's an old World War II tank. It's been impressed in the service in the 1970s. Still effective for what they were using it for. As we get towards modern times, the world has become increasingly dangerous for tanks. A lot of people think of tanks as being like the ultimate weapon in terms of land war, that you can fight behind armor and you're shielded and protected. But actually what the Germans were doing at the end of World War II with those Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck designs got taken forward as well. And in the 1970s, the Russians built the AT-4, which is this thing. The Americans developed the TOW missile, which gave the infantrymen the ability to destroy a tank fairly easily. And the biggest threat to tanks, these multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment, is actually the individual infantryman, armed with an anti-tank launched rocket, or an anti-tank guided missile, if you want to use the military acronym. Each one of these things you can knock out a tank with very easily. And so you've got this constant struggle between armor and warhead. As these type of ATGMs get better and better, this is a TOW2, this is what we use currently in this role, what you've got is an initial warhead on the front. And the reason you've got two warheads on this is that tanks start building up reactive armor. And people were talking about that before class. You put reactive armor plates on a tank, and maybe the TOW1 can't get through it. Reactive armor plates explode when hit and direct the explosion outward from the tank. So if you're manufacturing these types of ATGMs, you've got to find a solution. What do? You put a secondary explosive device on the front. So the secondary device detonates that enhanced reactive armor and clears the way for the main projectile to strike the tank. You do that more and more, and you've got this arms race going on. Into modern times, designs like the T-72 and T-80, Russian designs, modern tank designs. The Russian T-72 is unique because it is the first tank in the world mass-produced to make use of an autoloader. They were able to take that fourth crewman out and make the tank smaller because there's a mechanical device that reloads the gun. The Americans have gone a completely different route. Most of the NATO designs have. They still retain 4 crewmen. This is the current U.S. tank in service, the M1 Abrams. People often ask, if you go online, you'll see all sorts of arguments. Which is the better tank? Is it the Abrams or is it the T-80 or the T-90, whichever one you want to go with? Well, every time we've crossed paths, the Abrams has won. So, it's maybe not a fair comparison because we haven't actually fought the Russians in these things. We fought this type of design crewed by third world armies primarily. So some of you asked about reactive armor, a couple pictures of what this looks like. This is a Russian T-80 tank. You can see the little brick-looking things on it. That's reactive armor. Each one of those contains high explosive. If it's struck by a shell or a missile, it directs the explosion back out away from the tank. At that point, you have to replace that particular brick where there's a gap in the armor. This is American reactive armor on an M1 Abrams. It's called TUSK, T-U-S-K. The TUSK reactive armor is primarily designed to prevent things like RPG fire in places like Fallujah from striking the sides or the vulnerable edges of the tank. Late Cold War designs. The Russians kind of stick with their BMP. They upgun it a little bit. They have more modern weapons and aiming systems and things on it. The Americans completely redo theirs. That M113 was not a good vehicle at all. We go to the M2 and the M3 Bradley. It's this thing. You've probably seen it in the news. It has a 20-millimeter Bushmaster cannon on it, chain gun. Off to the side, this sort of boxy-looking thing on the side of the turret carries 2 TOW missiles. So this infantry fighting vehicle can carry 8 infantrymen in the back, can support them with a revolving turret if it needs to, and if it runs into enemy armor, it can handle that as well. It's a pretty effective design. Although, the problem with it is that it makes use of aluminum armor, and if you don't know, the problem with that is that it does tend to burn. The Bradleys there's sort of a love-hate relationship with Bradleys and their crews. Picture of an American M1 Abrams. One of the biggest threats that armor, tanks, things like that face in the modern battlefield is not other tanks. Every time the U.S. military recently has come up against opponents, we handle the tanks with no problem. The big threat to tanks is mines, because if you get a track blown off, you just sit there until it gets repaired, and things like IEDs. So in closing, as we're starting to get done here, about to close it up, modern armored fighting vehicles. One of the biggest things that they bring to the table, one of the biggest things that they add to this whole warfighting thing is the connectivity issue. I mean, we're fighting now in a time, you've probably heard the phrase, the digital battlefield, the digital battle space. People who do like information technology are critical to warfighting success. So the infantryman can only carry so much stuff on his person. He's already loaded down with ammunition and everything else. But if you have an armored fighting vehicle, you've got the ability to carry a lot more information technology. The way this works, you get AFV crewmen, armored fighting vehicle crewmen. They're looking downrange, they're seeing enemy targets. They can beam that data up digitally to a plane like this, it's called the J-STARS aircraft. It beams the signal back down to Allied units, and it allows for commanders to get a pretty good idea of what's happening around the battlefield. It gives them greater battlefield awareness. So part of the current role for armored fighting vehicles is their role in this information battle space. We'll kind of leave it with this as we close out. I think I have one more slide I'll show you just for the picture. But basically, when you think of stuff like tanks and armor, this is an American M1 Abrams. It's outside Najaf in Iraq in 2003. These things are very good vehicles, but they do have weak points. They do have vulnerabilities, right? You can't armor this thing completely against all threats. If you have people who know where the vulnerabilities on something like this are, and they're able to exploit it, you can destroy something like an M1 Abrams. Now, in this particular case, all 4 crewmen got out. I mean, that tank is completely a write-off. But the crew got out because these vehicles are designed for greater crew survivability. Where you're at right now, people are writing things in military journals and saying the day of the tank is past. I don't think so, personally. There's people who are saying this is the way of the future. What is it? It's an armored car. We're back to the armored car. They call it the Striker design. Basically, it's an 8-wheeled armored car with a big gun on it. And the reason that many people say this is the way forward is that these are very light. You can put these things inside of a C-17 cargo aircraft. You can fly them across oceans, quite a few of them. And so this is more deployable. This is lighter. It's faster on roads. My counter to that, though, is that if you say, well, the day of the tank is past, let's call the Abrams in the junkyards. What happens if you have to fight Russia or China? Do you really want to be a crewman of a Striker AFV going up against a Russian T-90 or the Chinese equivalent? Probably not. You're going with a lighter vehicle, less armor, up against somebody with much heavier armor and a gun that's at least as big as you've got. Conclusions. This picture was taken in Afghanistan in 2007. 2007. What is it? It's a French FT-17. Those things are still around. What? Yeah. He's like, look at this. Check this out. That's the frontline armored fighting force of the Afghan National Army. All right. Questions? I'm happy to take them. I know we covered a lot. I'll see you. Did your recording hold out that whole time?
Doing that?
Did it record the whole time?
Yeah, it's still rolling.